On a warm May afternoon in 1984, a farmer in Rutherford County, Tennessee, walked through the tall grass near the old Hoover Rock Quarry. It was around 6 p.m., and he was doing his usual evening check of his property line, looking for stray livestock that might have wandered too far from the main pasture. His boot caught on something soft hidden in the grass. At first, he thought maybe it was a deer that had been hit by a car and crawled off to pass. But when he looked down and pushed aside the tall grass, his blood went cold. His hands started shaking. What he saw beneath a pile of clothing would haunt him for the rest of his life. It was the body of a young woman. She couldn't have been more than 20 years old. She wore only a bra, nothing else. Someone had tried to cover her with clothing. 2 pairs of jeans lay draped across her body, along with a dark jacket. One pair of jeans appeared to be women's, Sergio Valente brand, the kind popular with young women in the early 1980s. But the other pair, men's jeans, Rustler brand, size 30 waist, 36-inch inseam. They were the kind of detail that would stick in investigators' minds for years. Why would a woman's body be covered with men's jeans? Whose jeans were they? The farmer's hands trembled as he backed away from the scene and ran to call the sheriff. Nobody could have known it then, but those jeans were about to become the most patient witness in Tennessee criminal history. They would hold their secrets, preserving evidence in their fibers, wading through technological revolutions and investigative dead ends. They would wait 16 years to finally tell their story. Laura Salmon's last day alive started like any other Thursday. She woke up in her dorm room, got dressed for work, and headed to her cashier job at the local Kroger supermarket. She was saving money for college, working the kind of minimum wage job that thousands of college students work every day. Her co-workers would later remember that she seemed normal that day. She wasn't nervous or scared. She chatted with them during breaks, counted her drawer at the end of her shift, and clocked out at exactly 1 p.m., right on schedule. She'd changed out of her work clothes and into those Sergio Valente jeans, the pair that would later be found on her body. She told her co-workers she had 2 stops to make. First, she wanted to check her grades at MTSU. It was near the end of the semester, and like any college student, she was anxious to see how she'd done. After that, she planned to drive to her grandmother's house for a swim. It was warm for May, and her grandmother had invited her over to use the pool. She never made it to check her grades. She never arrived at her grandmother's house. Somewhere between her workplace and her planned destinations, Laura's path intersected with someone who had other plans for her afternoon. When police found her car later that evening, after her body was discovered, it was parked miles from both the scene and any of Laura's intended destinations. The car sat in a different part of town, abandoned in a parking area where it wouldn't draw immediate attention. Investigators processed every inch of that vehicle. They dusted for fingerprints and found nothing. Not one single print. Someone had wiped it completely clean. But you know what they say? Nobody's perfect, and criminals almost always leave something behind. In this case, they found 2 crucial pieces of evidence. First, a single hair that didn't belong to Laura. In 1984, hair evidence was analyzed under microscopes, comparing the physical characteristics of strands. It wasn't as definitive as DNA, but it could at least narrow down possibilities. The hair would later be compared to several suspects. Second, and more telling, was the dirt. In the wheel wells and on the floor mats, forensic analysts found soil samples. When they compared these samples to soil from various locations around Rutherford County, they found a match. The dirt came from that remote area near the Hoover Rock Quarry, exactly where Laura's body was found. Someone had driven Laura's car to that quarry. They'd driven it on that unpaved access road, getting dirt embedded in the wheel wells. And then they'd driven it away, carefully wiping down every surface to remove fingerprints, and abandoned it across town. The question was simple but haunting. Who would go to such elaborate lengths to cover their tracks? When the medical examiner arrived at the scene, the sun was beginning to set over the quarry. The remote location wasn't an accident. Whoever did this had chosen it carefully. This area wasn't visible from any main roads. You had to know it was here. The victim was later identified as Laura Salmon, an 18-year-old student at Middle Tennessee State University. She'd been someone's daughter, someone's friend, a young woman with her whole life ahead of her. Now she was a crime scene. The medical examiner's report would paint a horrifying picture of her final moments. Laura had been struck in the head up to 10 times with rocks from the quarry. Not small rocks, heavy ones that required force to lift and bring down. The pathologist noted that several of the blows would have been fatal on their own, but the attack hadn't stopped there. Someone had kept going, kept hitting her even after she was gone. The blood spatter at the scene told its own story. The pattern indicated that whoever ended Laura's life had been kneeling beside her when they struck her. Think about that. This wasn't someone standing over her in a moment of panic. This was someone who had gotten down on their knees, taken their time, and repeatedly brought rocks down on her head. But the ending itself, as brutal as it was, wasn't the only evidence left behind. On those mysterious men's jeans covering her body, investigators found semen. In 1984, this was just biological evidence that could tell them someone had been intimate recently, but they had no way to match it to a specific person. DNA profiling wouldn't become available for criminal investigations for several more years. That evidence went into a bag, got labeled, and went into storage. It would sit there, waiting for technology to catch up with justice. When detectives sat down with Laura's mother, Laureen Mackey, she was still in shock from identifying her daughter's body. But when they asked if Laura had any enemies, if anyone might have wanted to hurt her, her answer came without hesitation. "Kyle," she said, her voice flat with certainty. "Kyle Gilley did this. I know he did." Kyle Gilley. The name that would dominate the investigation for the next 2 decades. Kyle was Laura's boyfriend from their high school days at Oakland High School in Murfreesboro. But calling him her boyfriend, or ex-boyfriend, doesn't quite capture the complexity and toxicity of their relationship. The truth is more complicated and far more disturbing. Kyle Gilley was 18 years old in May 1984, the same age as Laura, but physically, he towered over her at 6'2". He had a presence that made people uncomfortable. Around Oakland High School, his reputation preceded him, and it wasn't a good reputation. His stepfather immediately provided him with an alibi when police first questioned Kyle. He claimed Kyle had been home during the time Laura was taken and ended. The stepfather seemed certain, confident. And in those early days of the investigation, when detectives didn't have much to go on, that alibi was enough to keep Kyle from being arrested. But here's what Laura's mother told investigators, and what her friends would later confirm. Kyle Gilley was violently, obsessively jealous. He couldn't stand the thought of Laura being with anyone else. When they were dating in high school, he would patrol the hallways between classes, making sure she wasn't talking to other boys. If he saw her laughing with a male classmate, there would be consequences later. The consequences were always physical, always violent. Laura's friends told detectives stories that made them sick. They described seeing Kyle grab Laura by her hair and slam her head into lockers. They'd witnessed him punch her in the hallways. One friend recounted an incident where Kyle had grabbed Laura's head and repeatedly slammed it into the side of a car in the school parking lot because she'd smiled at another student. Laura had shown up to class one day with her front teeth broken. When friends asked what happened, she'd given some excuse about an accident. But everyone knew. Kyle had done it. He'd always done it. Think about that for a second. Laura was walking around her high school with broken teeth, visible evidence of abuse. And yet the relationship continued. Why? Because she was terrified of what Kyle would do if she tried to leave him. When Laura graduated and enrolled at Middle Tennessee State University, her friends thought maybe this would be her chance to escape. Kyle didn't go to MTSU. Maybe the physical distance would finally give Laura the freedom she'd been denied in high school. But Kyle didn't see it that way. He saw Laura going to college as a threat. What if she met someone else? What if she started dating other guys? What if she found someone who treated her with kindness instead of violence? So Kyle started showing up at MTSU. He'd appear at the student center, at the gym, at fraternity parties that Laura attended. He wasn't a student there, but nobody questioned it. Colleges in the 1980s weren't as security conscious as they are today. He could just walk onto campus whenever he wanted. Laura confided in her college friends that she wanted out of the relationship. She'd started seeing other guys. She tried to keep it quiet, begging her new romantic interests not to tell anyone, especially not Kyle. She was terrified of what he would do if he found out she was dating other people. The night before her body was found, witnesses saw Laura dancing with an unidentified man at a local venue. She looked happy, carefree even. For a few hours, she got to feel like a normal 18-year-old college student dancing without fear. But someone might have been watching from the shadows. Someone who couldn't bear to see Laura happy with another man. Someone whose jealousy had been building like pressure in a closed container, waiting to explode. When detectives initially questioned Kyle about Laura's passing, he seemed cooperative. He admitted they'd dated for 2 years in high school. He claimed they'd stayed friends after high school ended. He denied ever being violent with her. He denied being jealous. He said he'd never been to that quarry where her body was found. And his stepfather backed him up. Kyle was home that afternoon, he insisted. There was no way Kyle could have done this. Case closed. Or so it seemed in those first weeks of the investigation. The investigation produced 100 suspects, 100 dead ends. 40 miles from the scene, a woman contacted police with a shocking accusation. John Taylor had assaulted her, she claimed. And during the attack, he threatened her with Laura's fate. Taylor attended the same university as Laura, went to the same health club, showed up at the same fraternity gatherings. Under FBI microscopes, a hair found in Laura's car appeared consistent with Taylor's hair. But in 1984, hair analysis was subjective at best, and those men's jeans were too long for Taylor's shorter frame. The evidence didn't quite fit. The case grew cold. Years turned into decades. The jeans remained in evidence storage, holding their secrets. Dan Goodwin stood at Laura's funeral as a young man, watching her mother's devastation. She grabbed his arm and begged him to help find her daughter's ending. He didn't know it then, but that moment would define his entire career. Goodwin became a crime reporter, writing about unsolved cases including Laura's. But journalism felt like watching from the sidelines when he wanted to be on the field. Years later, he traded his press credentials for a detective's badge with the Rutherford County Sheriff's Office. His first cold case assignment? Laura Salmon. Some might call it fate. Others might call it justice waiting for the right person. Either way, Goodwin was back in Laura's orbit. determined to keep his promise. By the year 2000, the world of forensic science had transformed completely from what it had been in 1984. DNA testing, once the stuff of science fiction novels, had become routine in criminal investigations across the country. Evidence that had gathered dust in storage lockers for 16 years suddenly held new promise and new possibilities for justice. The Cold Case Unit at the Rutherford County Sheriff's Office began systematically re-examining old unsolved cases, looking for evidence that could now be tested with modern technology. Laura Salmon's case was near the top of their list. A casual conversation overheard in a high school hallway sparked fresh hope. Someone reported that David Patterson's son had allegedly boasted that his father had ended a girl years ago and thrown her body in a quarry. The details were chilling, and they matched Laura's case. Patterson had a documented history of violence. His criminal record showed multiple assaults. He fit the profile. But there was one major problem. David Patterson was already gone. He'd been eliminated in a shooting before investigators could ever question him about Laura's ending. Still, DNA could prove or disprove his involvement, even posthumously. The Patterson family voluntarily provided DNA samples for comparison. They wanted to know the truth, just like everyone else. The results came back quickly. No match. David Patterson, despite the rumors and his violent history, had nothing to do with Laura Salmon's ending. Another dead end in a case that seemed cursed with dead ends. John Taylor's DNA was tested next. You remember John Taylor, the man who'd attended MTSU with Laura? The one who'd allegedly threatened another woman by referencing Laura's fate. His hair had been found in Laura's car, or at least a hair that looked similar to his under a microscope. Again, investigators waited for results. Again, no match. Even Dan Goodwin, who'd now become one of the lead detectives on the case, provided his own DNA sample. He'd known Laura back in high school, had been at her funeral, and ethics demanded that he eliminate himself from suspicion, even though nobody seriously considered him a suspect. His results came back clean, as expected. But buried deep in the original case files, Dan and his partner Bill Sharp found something the original investigators had somehow missed. A witness who had seen Kyle Gilley driving Laura's car near the quarry on May 31st, 1984. How had this been overlooked? The woman had gotten a crystal clear look at Kyle as she drove past. He sat rigid behind the wheel of Laura's distinctive car, staring straight ahead with a blank expression that gave her chills. She identified him from a photo lineup. She identified the car. This witness had been there all along. Her statement had been taken. It had been filed. And then it had been forgotten for 16 years. Crime scene reconstructionist Jerry Findley examined those mysterious men's genes under magnification. What he discovered would break the case wide open. Tiny droplets of blood were embedded in the fabric, not just any blood spatter. Medium velocity impact spatter. The kind created when someone is struck with a blunt object. The pattern told a precise story. The person wearing these jeans had been kneeling when the strikes occurred. The spatter had hit the fabric between the knee and the waist, exactly where you'd expect if someone was kneeling over a victim, bringing rocks down again and again. DNA testing confirmed what everyone suspected. It was Laura's blood. Kyle Gilley stood 6 on 2 inches tall. Those jeans, size 30 waist with a 36-inch inseam, would have fit him perfectly. As investigators dug deeper, they uncovered the true horror of Laura's final year. Former classmates came forward with stories they'd kept silent for years. Kyle's jealous rages were legendary. When Laura started making friends at college, Kyle would show up uninvited. When she tried to distance herself, He'd terrorize her back into submission through violence and intimidation. One witness described how Kyle had taken Laura to the edge of a quarry and dangled her over the edge, threatening to drop her. Laura had confided in friends that she wanted out of the relationship, but was terrified of what Kyle would do if he found out she was seeing other people. She had good reason to be afraid. 16 years after ending Laura's life, Kyle Gilley had rebuilt his existence in Bradenton, Florida. He'd been married twice. Both marriages ended. He worked for Manatee County's Public Works Department, living a seemingly normal life, convinced his past was buried forever. On May 9, 2000, detectives knocked on his door. The interview started calmly. Kyle denied being jealous. He denied being violent with Laura. He denied having relations with her in the days before her ending. He even claimed he'd never been to the rock quarry before her body was found there. When investigators told him they had DNA evidence and blood spatter analysis, Kyle immediately asked for a lawyer. The interview was over. But they already had what they needed. Kyle had provided a DNA sample under warrant. The anniversary. On May 31, 2000, exactly 16 years to the day after Laura Salmon was found, the final DNA results arrived at the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation. Kyle Gilley's DNA was a perfect match to the semen found on the jeans covering Laura's body. The jeans had finally spoken, and their testimony was devastating. Those jeans had absorbed Laura's blood as Kyle knelt over her, ending her life with rocks. They contained his semen from their last encounter. They were size 30 waist, 36-inch inseam, Kyle's exact size. And he'd stripped them off, leaving them with her body, not realizing that the blood evidence would one day condemn him. In 1984, he thought he'd gotten away with it. By 2000, forensic science had caught up with him. 22 years after ending Laura's life, Kyle Gilley faced a Tennessee jury in August 2006. His defense team argued that unknown DNA from Laura's consensual encounter proved someone else was responsible. They suggested the genes could have belonged to a woman, desperate grasping at straws. But the prosecution painted a damning picture. They brought witness after witness who described Kyle's obsessive jealousy, his violent outbursts, his stalking behavior. They showed the jury the blood spatter evidence, explained how the pattern proved the wearer had been kneeling over Laura as he struck her. They presented testimony about how Kyle had terrorized Laura, breaking her teeth, slamming her head into cars and lockers, dangling her over the edge of a quarry while threatening to drop her. Multiple witnesses testified they'd seen injuries on Laura's body and heard her express fear of Kyle. The defense called Kyle's brother as an alibi witness, but that carefully constructed alibi had already fallen apart. A witness had seen Kyle driving Laura's car near the quarry that afternoon. The dirt in Laura's car wheel wells matched the quarry soil. And those jeans, Kyle had admitted they were probably his. The evidence was overwhelming. The jury saw through the defense's desperate attempts to create reasonable doubt. After hearing weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated. When they returned to the courtroom, their verdict was clear and final. Guilty. First-degree intentional ending of life. Kyle Gilley had taken Laura to that quarry on May 31, 1984. Maybe he'd convinced her to meet him to talk. Maybe he'd forced her there. Either way, their conversation had erupted into an argument that ended with Kyle grabbing nearby rocks and beating Laura repeatedly as she lay defenseless. The blood spatter on his jeans proved he'd knelt over her as he struck her. When he realized the blood would condemn him, he stripped off the jeans and left them with her body, covering her with clothing as if that would somehow erase what he'd done. He drove her car away from the scene. carefully wiping it clean of fingerprints before abandoning it. Then he went home, told his stepfather he'd been there all afternoon, and tried to move on with his life. For 16 years, it looked like he might actually succeed. Justice delayed. The judge sentenced Kyle Gilley to life in prison. Under Tennessee law, he would be eligible for parole on September 25, 2042, nearly 60 years after he ended Laura's life. Laura's mother had waited 22 years for this moment. Dan Goodwin had kept the promise he made at a teenager's funeral. The detectives who never gave up on Laura's case had proven that time doesn't erase guilt. It only delays justice. The case became a landmark example of how advancing technology could revive the coldest of cold cases. Those men's genes had sat in evidence storage for 16 years, waiting patiently for science to evolve enough to read their story. Every microscopic droplet of blood, every trace of DNA, every fiber and stain had preserved the truth. Where is he now? As of 2025, David Kyle Gilley remains incarcerated at the Northeast Correctional Complex in Tennessee. He's tried multiple times to appeal his conviction, arguing everything from ineffective counsel to claims that the evidence was prejudicial. The Tennessee Supreme Court has denied every single appeal. In 2009, they rejected his first major appeal. When he tried again years later, they again refused to hear his case. The courts have repeatedly affirmed what the jury decided in 2006. Kyle Gilley is exactly where he belongs. He will remain in prison until at least 2042, when he becomes eligible for parole at age 76. Given the nature of his offense and his history of violence, parole is far from guaranteed. Laura Salmon's grave in Murfreesboro stands as a reminder of a young woman whose life was stolen when she was just 18. Her case was featured on Forensic Files in an episode called Gene Pool, helping educate the public about how blood spatter analysis and DNA evidence can solve cases decades after the offense. Dan Goodwin continued his career in law enforcement, solving numerous other cold cases. He often spoke about Laura's case as proof that investigators should never give up, no matter how much time has passed. The witness who saw Kyle driving Laura's car that afternoon, the one whose testimony was somehow overlooked for 16 years, never understood how her statement got buried in the files. But when detectives finally found it, her clear identification of Kyle became another crucial piece of the puzzle. Laura Salmon's case proves something important about justice. It may be slow, but it's patient. And in the end, the truth always surfaces, even if it takes decades. Think about those jeans one more time. They were just ordinary men's jeans, probably bought at a department store somewhere in Tennessee. Kyle Gilley wore them to end someone's life, then abandoned them because they were covered in evidence. He thought he was being smart, leaving them behind. But those jeans became the most persistent witnesses in the case. They held on to Laura's blood in microscopic droplets. They preserved Kyle's DNA. They matched his exact measurements. They waited in evidence storage through technological revolutions, through the development of DNA testing, through 16 years of Kyle building a new life in Florida. The genes never forgot. Blood doesn't lie. DNA doesn't fade. And science, when it finally catches up, is absolutely merciless to those who thought they'd escaped justice. Kyle Gilley's stepfather gave him an alibi in 1984. That alibi held for 16 years. But alibis can't stand against physical evidence. They can't explain away blood spatter patterns. They can't argue with DNA matches. Laura wanted to escape Kyle's obsessive control. She tried to build a life at college, make new friends, date other people, but Kyle couldn't let her go. His jealousy and rage consumed him that May afternoon in 1984, and in a fit of violence, He ended the life of the person he claimed to love. For Laura's family, the conviction brought some measure of peace. Not closure. You never really get closure when someone you love is taken violently. But at least they knew the truth. At least they knew Kyle would spend most of his remaining life behind bars. For other families waiting for justice in cold cases, Laura's story offers hope. Evidence doesn't expire. Technology improves. Dedicated investigators like Dan Goodwin exist. People who refuse to give up, who keep their promises, who believe every victim deserves justice no matter how much time has passed. The Tennessee field where Laura was found has returned to peaceful obscurity. Tall grass sways in the breeze. Most people driving past have no idea a young woman's life ended there 4 decades ago. But her case lives on in criminal justice textbooks, in forensics classes, in cold case units across the country. She became more than a victim. She became proof that determination, science, and time can work together to deliver justice, even when it seems impossible. Kyle Gilley sits in his prison cell today, a living example of what happens when killers underestimate forensic science. He thought 16 years was enough distance from his offense. He thought his new life in Florida meant he was safe. He was wrong. The genes waited, the evidence waited, justice waited. And in the end, Laura Salmon's story proves that some truths can't be buried, no matter how deep you try to hide them. All they need is time, technology, and investigators who refuse to forget.